Welcome to this little corner of other people's lives. Sometimes someone else's truth is scarier than any fiction. Let's check. The sun was lazily spreading across the horizon, filling the suburban block with golden light. Maplewood Street, neat as a postcard from a country magazine, sparkled with cleanliness. Perfectly trimmed lawns, snow-white picket fences, flower beds where every petal seemed to be measured with a ruler. The house at number 17 did not stand out from this idyll. 2 stories with large windows framed by wooden shutters, and a porch on which stood 2 wicker chairs and a table with a vase of freshly cut peonies. Here lived Andrew and Rachel Carter, a couple that neighbors called perfect. At first glance, they were. Andrew, 42, tall, with a touch of gray at the temples, was a man you could easily imagine on the cover of a business magazine. His career at the IT company Nexus was rapidly on the rise. He started as a programmer and now managed an entire department responsible for developing cloud solutions. Andrew knew how to talk in a way that people listened to him with a slight husky voice, confidently, but without arrogance. His dark blue suits were always impeccably pressed, and his smile was the one that made the interlocutor feel special. He was the kind of guy who could convince a client to sign a contract over a cup of coffee and colleagues to work overtime for the sake of a common goal. But at home, behind closed doors, Andrew sometimes became different, silent, lost in his thoughts, as if part of him remained in the office. Rachel, 39, was the opposite of this reserved efficiency. She had energy like the morning wind that ruffles the leaves in the park. A fitness trainer with a reputation for inspiring even the laziest of clients, she spent her days in the gym helping people find their best selves. Her long brown hair, usually pulled back into a high ponytail, and her bright green eyes made her stand out in any crowd. Rachel loved to laugh loudly, infectiously, so that even random passers-by couldn't help but smile. But lately her laughter had become less frequent, and there was sometimes a shadow in her eyes that she quickly hid behind her usual smile. Their home was a reflection of themselves, neat, stylish, but with subtle cracks in the picture-perfect image. The living room, furnished in Scandinavian-style light wood, soft gray sofas, fluffy carpet, felt like a place where comfort always reigned. There were photographs on the mantel, Andrew and Rachel on the beach in Mexico, their wedding 10 years ago, a hike together in the Colorado mountains. But a careful eye would notice that there hadn't been any new pictures in a couple of years, and that the house was too quiet. No children's laughter, no barking dog, not even the hum of the television. Just the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional footstep. Mornings at the Carter house began like clockwork. Andrew would wake up at 6, brew coffee in the expensive coffee maker they'd bought last year, and check his email as the light slowly grew outside. Rachel would rise a half hour later, do a quick workout in the backyard, and then make breakfast, usually oatmeal with berries and nuts, which Andrew would eat while staring at his phone. Conversations at the table were brief, about the weather, about plans for the day, about who would pick up the package containing the new water filter. It all seemed familiar, as smooth as a Swiss watch. But something in that mechanism was beginning to creak. "Are you late today?" Rachel asked, stirring the yogurt in her bowl with a spoon. Her voice was light, but there was a subtle tension in it. Andrew, without looking up from the screen, answered, "Most likely. We have a deadline for the project. We need to close a couple of issues with the client." He took a sip of coffee and added, almost automatically, "Don't expect me for dinner." Rachel nodded, looking out the window. She was used to those words. "Don't expect me for dinner" was as common in their house as "good morning." She didn't argue, though her chest hurt. Instead, she stood up, put her plate in the dishwasher, and said, "I have a new group practice tonight. Maybe we can get some pizza when you get back." "Sounds great," Andrew said, finally looking up from his phone. He smiled at her, the same smile that had once made her fall in love. But now it seems routine. Rachel walked out of the kitchen, feeling the silence of the house settle around her like a cool blanket. She walked into the living room, stopped by the mantel, and ran her finger along the framed photograph of their wedding. It showed them laughing, holding each other against the sunset. It felt like the world belonged to them. What has changed? She couldn't quite tell, but she felt something slipping away, slowly, like sand through her fingers. Andrew's day was scheduled down to the minute. The Nexus office was in the center of the city, in a glass skyscraper that sparkled in the sun like a giant crystal. His office on the 23rd floor was spacious, with a panoramic view of the city's rooftops and the river snaking in the distance. On his desk was a neat stack of paperwork, a laptop with a dozen tabs open, and a silver-framed photograph of Rachel. She was smiling in the picture, standing on a mountaintop, her hair blown about by the wind. Andrew rarely looked at the photo, but it was as much a part of his world as his morning coffee or his daily meetings. Today was going to be a busy day. A new client, a major financial services company, was asking for security improvements to their cloud storage system. Andrew had spent the morning in meetings, explaining technical details to people who barely understood the difference between a server and a processor. His team of 7 was working in the office next door, and he kept dropping in to discuss their progress. Everything was going smoothly, but Andrew felt a slight tension inside. Not because of the work, he was doing brilliantly at that. Something else, elusive as a shadow, was flickering through his thoughts. At lunchtime, he went down to the cafe on the ground floor. He ordered a sandwich and a latte, sat by the window, and opened the news feed on his phone. Among the headlines about politics and technology, a text from Rachel flashed by. "Don't forget the pizza. Maybe with anchovies, just the way you like it." Andrew smiled, but it quickly faded. He wrote a short, "Okay, I'll order. See you tonight." He buried his face in his phone again, although in his head he was thinking, when was the last time we had dinner together? Meanwhile, Rachel was spending the day at the Energy Fitness Center, where she had worked for 5 years. The gym was her element. The smell of rubber from the mats, the rhythmic music, the hum of clients' voices mingling with the clank of weights. Today, she was leading a group workout. 10 people, from office workers to housewives, were trying to follow her through a series of balance and strength exercises. Rachel moved with the ease and grace of a dancer, shouting out commands. "Knees up. 3 more, 2, 1, hold the plank." Her voice was cheerful, but her thoughts kept slipping away from home. She remembered her morning conversation with Andrew, his distant look, his "don't come for dinner." It was nothing new, but it always left a bad taste in her mouth. She loved her job, her clients, her life. But a loneliness she hadn't expected was creeping into her days more and more often. After the workout, one of the clients, Linda, a woman in her 50s with a good-natured smile, lingered at the exit. "Rachel, you're a magician," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "How do you stay so energetic?" Rachel laughed, but it sounded a little forced. "Lots of coffee and good music," she replied with a wink. Linda nodded, but her gaze became more serious. "You know, I used to be like that too. Always on the move, always busy. But sometimes you need to stop and just be with those you care about." She paused, as if choosing her words. "You're married, right? Don't forget about him." Rachel felt something tighten in her chest. She smiled, but this time the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Linda. I appreciate your concern." After the woman left, Rachel stood at the reception desk, looking at herself in the mirror. She looked the same as always, fit, confident, lightly tanned from her morning runs. But deep down, she felt like something was wrong. Not with her, not with Andrew, but with what was between them. Like the thread that held them together was beginning to fray. Andrew stayed at the office longer than he had planned as the evening wore on. The meeting was running long, the client was asking for more reports, and the team was starting to buckle under the pressure of deadlines. When he finally left the building, the city was starting to darken. The streets were aglow with lights, and Andrew suddenly found himself not wanting to go home. Not because he didn't love Rachel, he did, in his own deep, sincere way, but home had become a place where he felt out of place. Like his presence there was unnecessary. He ordered a pizza on the way, choosing the anchovy kind he and Rachel had loved in the early years of their marriage. In the car, with jazz playing softly on the radio, he remembered how they had sat on the floor of their first apartment, eating pizza straight from the box and laughing at something silly. Everything had seemed simpler then. Rachel came home from work, showered, and changed into a soft sweater and jeans. She put on some music, an old Coldplay album that she and Andrew had listened to early in their relationship, and began setting the table. 2 glasses, a bottle of red wine, and plates. She tried to make the evening cozy, but deep down she knew Andrew would probably be tired when he arrived, and their conversation would be limited to a few sentences. When he walked into the house carrying a pizza box, Rachel greeted him with a smile. "Finally, a corporate hero," she said, trying to sound light. Andrew chuckled, put the box on the table, and kissed her forehead. "Sorry it's late. It's been a busy day." "Same as always," she said, opening the box. The smell of pizza filled the kitchen, and for a moment, everything felt right. They sat down at the table, poured wine, and Rachel began to tell him about her workout, about the funny client who almost fell off the mat. Andrew listened, nodded, occasionally interjected, but his gaze kept returning to the phone lying next to him. "Hey," Rachel said quietly when the silence became too long. "Are you there?" Andrew blinked, as if waking up. "Yes, of course. Just thoughts about work." She nodded, but her chest hurt again. They finished the pizza, finished the wine, and the evening ended like so many others. Andrew went into the office to check his email, and Rachel stayed behind to clear the table. The silence of the house washed over her again, and this time it seemed heavier than usual. Late that night, after Andrew had fallen asleep, Rachel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Moonlight streamed through the curtains, casting strange shadows on the walls. She thought about how their lives had changed so subtly. There had been no big fights, no scandals, no betrayals. Just small cracks, words left unsaid, moments unlived, loneliness they both felt but did not discuss. She turned on her side, looking at Andrew as he slept. His face, lit by the dim light, looked calm, almost boyish. She reached out to touch him, but stopped halfway. Something needs to change, she thought, but she didn't know what yet. Saturday night in Maplewood was as quiet as ever, but the Carter household was unusually bustling. Rachel was rushing between the kitchen and the living room, setting out plates of appetizers and making sure the wine was at the right temperature. They were hosting Mark and Sarah, old friends they had met early in their marriage. Dinner was supposed to be cozy, one of those nights where you could relax, laugh, and forget about your routine for a moment. But something was already beginning to thicken in the air, like an invisible fog that no one had noticed yet. Rachel wore her favorite dress, a simple but elegant sea green that showed off her trim figure. She wore her hair in loose curls, adding a slick of lip gloss to make her look a little more festive. Andrew, home from work a little earlier than usual, had changed into a dark gray sweater and jeans, making him look like a man who had finally allowed himself to breathe. He helped set the table, but his movements were mechanical, and his mind seemed far away. "Are you sure Mark and Sarah won't want dessert?" Rachel asked, straightening the napkins on the table. "I made that lemon basil tart Sarah likes." Andrew shrugged as he put down the glasses. "They didn't warn me, but the tart definitely won't go to waste." He smiled, but it sounded a little tired. "You know, Mark is always on a diet, and Sarah nags him about it." Rachel laughed, and for a moment the tension she had felt these last few days eased. She loved these dinners, the moments when their house would fill with voices, laughter, warmth. It reminded her of the time when she and Andrew were first living together, when every evening had seemed like a little celebration. The guests arrived promptly at 7. Sarah, a short blonde with an infectious laugh, immediately hugged Rachel, admiring the aroma wafting from the kitchen. Mark, tall, with a light stubble and an ironic smile, handed Andrew a bottle of red wine. "This is for putting up with us," he said, clapping Andrew on the shoulder, "and for always making your house look like something out of a magazine." Andrew chuckled as he accepted the bottle. "It's all Rachel. I just moved the furniture at her command." Dinner began lightly. They sat at a large oak table in the dining room, lit by a soft pendant lamp. On the table were baked salmon with herbs, a vegetable salad with goat cheese, a crusty baguette, and, of course, wine, which Mark praised with the air of a connoisseur. Conversation flowed freely. Sarah told them about her new job at the gallery. Mark joked about their recent trip to Italy, where he managed to lose his wallet on the first day. Andrew shared stories about his latest project, skillfully balancing technical details with a lightheartedness so as not to bore them. Rachel, as always, was the life of the party, pouring wine, throwing in witty remarks, and making sure no one got bored. But beneath that surface ease, something was vibrating, subtle but palpable. Rachel found herself watching Andrew a little more closely than usual. His laughter, his gestures, his gaze, everything seemed familiar, yet alien. He was here, at the table, but part of him, as always, was somewhere else. She brushed the thought aside, chalking it up to fatigue. After the main course, Andrew excused himself to the backyard to take a call from a colleague. "Nothing urgent, just a few details," he said, walking away with the phone. Rachel watched him go, feeling the familiar needle of irritation prick somewhere in her chest. She turned to Sarah to continue the conversation about the new gallery show, but Mark, sitting across from her, suddenly leaned a little closer. "You're great as always, Rachel," he said, raising his glass. His tone was friendly, but there was a spark in his eyes that Rachel didn't immediately recognize. "Andrew is lucky to have you. Not every man can boast of a wife like you." Rachel smiled, used to Mark's compliments. He had always been a bit theatrical, a teaser, but never over the top. "Thank you, Mark. But you know I'm not one to sit still. Andrew, I think, sometimes wishes he had a quieter wife," she replied, rolling her eyes playfully. Mark laughed, but his gaze became more serious. He glanced sideways at Sarah, who was engrossed in a discussion with her table mate. Rachel had invited another friend, Lisa, to join him, discussing a painting. Making sure that no one was listening to their conversation, he lowered his voice. "Listen, Ratch, I've been thinking. You know that Andrew spends a lot of time at work, right?" Rachel frowned, not understanding what he was getting at. "Well, yes, he's always busy. It's his job, Mark. You know how it is." Mark nodded, but his smile was somehow slippery. He pulled out his phone, fiddled with it for a few seconds, and turned the screen toward Rachel. "Just came across this last week. They had a corporate party, right?" he said casually, but there was an underlying tone to his tone. On the screen was a photo of Andrew in a navy blue suit, standing next to a young woman in her 30s with short black hair and a bright smile. They were in an office, and judging by the backdrop with the Nexus logo and colorful garlands, they were obviously at some kind of party. The woman was holding a glass of wine, and Andrew was leaning toward her, as if she had just said something funny. His hand was resting on the back of her chair, a gesture that could be interpreted in many ways. Rachel felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She wasn't one to make a scene or jump to suspicion, but something about this photo, how close they were standing, the way Andrew was looking at this woman made her heart clench. "Who is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. Mark shrugged, putting his phone away. "Some colleagues, I guess. I just thought you should know. Andrew, well, you know, he's the star of the office, always the center of attention. And people like that," he nodded at the phone, "are always hanging around." Rachel swallowed, trying to clear the lump in her throat. She wanted to say something witty, to brush it off, but the words stuck. Instead, she forced a smile. "Thanks, Mark. But you know Andrew. He's just friendly." "Sure," Mark raised his hands in surrender. "I just thought it was better to show than to regret not showing. You're like a sister to me, Ratch." Sarah, having finished her conversation with Lisa, turned to them. "What are you whispering about, conspirators?" she asked with a smile, but there was a slight wariness in her voice. "Oh, just about Andrew's work," Mark quickly replied, winking at Rachel. "He seems to be the king of the office there." Rachel forced herself to laugh, but it was strained. She picked up her wine and took a long sip, trying to quell the storm that was beginning to rise inside her. Andrew returned a few minutes later, apologizing for the delay, and the evening continued as if nothing had happened. They ate tart, laughed at Mark's jokes, and discussed their plans for the summer. But for Rachel, everything had changed. The photo Mark had shown her had dropped like a tiny pebble into the calm waters of her thoughts, and the ripples around it had begun to spread. When the guests had left and the house was silent again, Rachel stood at the sink, washing the last of the dessert off the plates. Andrew came up behind her, put his arm around her waist, and kissed her neck. "Great evening, huh?" he said, his voice warm but tired. "Yes," she answered without turning around. "Excellent." She wanted to ask. She wanted to turn, look him in the eye, and ask about the woman, about the office party, about his hand on the back of the chair. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she kept washing dishes, listening to the water rushing in the sink, Mark's words echoing in her head. People like that are always hanging around. That night, Rachel lay awake for a long time. She lay there, staring into the darkness, feeling the first seed of doubt take root in her heart. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was already beginning to change everything. Monday morning at the Carter house began with the usual bustle, but for Rachel it was saturated with a new, acrid feeling that she could neither name nor shake. The sun streamed into the kitchen, reflecting off the crisp white countertops, but its warmth could not penetrate the chill that had settled in her chest. The photo Mark had shown her was like a splinter, tiny but painful, a constant reminder of itself. Rachel stood at the stove, mechanically stirring oatmeal, while Andrew, now in a shirt and tie, scrolled through the news on his tablet. His fingers moved across the screen with the same confidence with which he conducted negotiations in the office, but to Rachel every gesture now seemed suspicious. She tried to push away the thoughts Mark had planted in her mind, whether intentionally or not. Andrew had always been charming, always drawn to people, especially women. That wasn't news, but she'd always thought of it as part of his charisma, as what made him. Andrew. Now, every glance he'd given her, every smile in that photo, seemed like evidence in a case she'd made up. And it made her angry not just at him, but at herself for allowing those thoughts to take root. "Andrew," she began, trying to sound light, almost casual. She placed the bowl of oatmeal in front of him and sat down across from him. "Do you have a lot of office parties?" He looked up from his tablet, frowning slightly, but then smiled. "Not that often. The last one was a couple of weeks ago, some company anniversary." "Why?" His tone was casual, without a hint of tension, but Rachel was looking for something in it, a hint, a lie, an evasiveness. She found nothing. "Just like that," she replied, shrugging. "Mark mentioned something about your party, said you were the center of attention there." Andrew laughed, putting his tablet down and reaching for a spoon. "Mark exaggerates, as always. I spent more time running around with paperwork than having fun." He paused, looking at her with a hint of mockery. "You don't think I danced on tables, do you?" Rachel forced herself to smile, but something inside her was clenching. She wanted to ask directly, who was that woman? Why were you standing so close? What are you hiding? But the words stuck in her throat like the bones of the fish she'd eaten at dinner with Mark and Sarah. Instead, she said, "No, of course not. It's just interesting. You spend so much time at work, and I know almost nothing about your colleagues." Andrew shrugged, returning to his oatmeal. "Nothing special. The usual office routine. If you want, I can tell you, but believe me, it's boring." He glanced at his watch and stood up. "I have to go. Today I'm swamped again. I need to prepare a presentation for tomorrow's meeting." Rachel nodded, feeling the moment slipping away. She wanted to hold him, to shake something out of him, but he was already halfway to the door, grabbing his briefcase and keys. "See you tonight," he called over his shoulder, and the front door slammed, leaving her in the silence of the kitchen. She sat there, staring at his half-eaten oatmeal, and felt anger boiling inside her. Not at him or not just at him. At herself for not asking. At Mark for showing her that stupid photo. At this woman whose face she couldn't get out of her head. Rachel stood up, abruptly putting the bowl in the sink, and the water that gushed from the faucet drowned out her thoughts. But not entirely. The day at Nexus Fitness Center was a blur. Rachel led 3 workouts in a row, barking out commands with her usual energy, but her mind was elsewhere. Clients noticed she was a little distracted, but no one said a word. Her reputation was too strong for anyone to question her professionalism. During a break, she sat in the trainer's room, scrolling through her phone, and found herself opening Nexus's social media profile. She was looking for any hint of the woman in the corporate photo, but all she found were the usual posts about the company's accomplishments, photos of smiling employees in matching t-shirts, and videos from a recent team building event. Andrew was in one of them, standing in a group of colleagues, laughing, holding a bottle of water. She scanned their faces, but the woman was gone. By the end of the day, Rachel felt like she'd run a marathon without training. The fatigue wasn't physical, but rather an internal, sticky feeling, as if her thoughts were spinning into a spiral she couldn't escape. She got home before Andrew, as usual, and instead of starting to cook dinner, she sat on the living room couch, staring at his laptop lying on the coffee table. He rarely left it at home, but today he must have forgotten it in his rush. Rachel knew his password. He hadn't changed it in years. She hadn't meant to go through his stuff. She'd never done anything like that before. But the seed of doubt Mark had planted had taken root, and now it was pulling at her like a magnet. She picked up the laptop, opened the lid, and froze. This is stupid, she thought. I trust him. It's just a photo, just a corporate event. But her fingers had already typed the password, and the screen lit up. She opened Andrew's email, her heart pounding in her chest. Nothing out of the ordinary. Work emails, reports, client correspondence. She scrolled through her inbox, looking for anything, a name that stood out, an email that looked out of place. But it was all eerily ordinary. She closed the email and opened the company messenger Andrew used to communicate with his colleagues. There was nothing there either. Discussions of projects, jokes about office coffee, a few links to tech articles. Not a single name that could belong to the woman in the photo. Not a single clue. Rachel slammed her laptop shut, furious with herself. She felt like a traitor not just to Andrew, but to herself. She was never like this, suspicious, petty, snoopy. But the lack of evidence only made her more frustrated. If she'd found anything, a text, a hint, even a misplaced emoji, she could have seized on it, had a conversation, let off some steam. As it was, she felt trapped in her own thoughts. When Andrew came home, she was already making dinner shrimp pasta, which he liked. She tried to act normal, but every gesture he made, the way he took off his jacket, the way he threw his keys on the hall table, was suspicious. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't stop. "How's your day?" he asked, sitting down at the table and opening a bottle of water. "Fine," she answered, too sharply, and then softened her tone. "A lot of training. Tired. And you?" "As usual," he said, rubbing his neck. "The client is changing his demands again. The team is on the verge of mutiny." He grinned, but Rachel didn't return his smile. She put the plates of pasta on the table and sat down opposite him. Silence hung between them, heavy as damp air before a storm. She wanted to ask about the office party, about the woman, but instead she said, "Do you often communicate with colleagues outside of work?" Andrew raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by the question. "Not really. Sometimes we write in the chat if something is urgent." "Why?" He looked at her, and there was nothing in his gaze except fatigue and slight bewilderment. Rachel shrugged, twirling her fork around in her plate. "It's just, you spend so much time there. I barely know who you work with." He sighed, putting his fork down. "Ratch, I told you, it's boring. Regular people, regular projects. If you want, come to the office sometime. I'll introduce you to the team." His tone was so open, so normal, that Rachel felt even worse. She nodded, muttering something unintelligible, and the rest of the dinner passed in silence. Andrew seemed not to notice her mood or pretended not to. After dinner, he went into the study as usual, and Rachel stayed behind to clear the table, feeling the poison of doubt consuming her from within. Later, while Andrew was in the shower, she picked up his phone. It was an impulsive decision, almost a reflex. She knew the code, he'd never hidden it from her. The screen lit up, and she quickly scrolled through messages, chats, notifications. Nothing. Not a suspicious name, not a single weird emoji. Just work messages, a couple of jokey texts from Mark, and one from her, reminding her about last Friday's pizza. She put the phone down, feeling anger mixed with relief and shame. She hadn't found anything, but that didn't calm her down. On the contrary, the lack of evidence only increased her anxiety. If he's not hiding anything, why do I feel like something's wrong? She thought, standing in the dark living room. The silence of the house, usually so familiar, now seemed hostile to her. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep again. She lay there, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, feeling the seed of doubt Mark had planted grow into something more poisonous, alive, ready to sprout new shoots. She didn't know what to do with it, but one thing was clear: it wouldn't go away on its own. Friday night in Maplewood was warm and expectant, but for Rachel Carter it was bitter, like wine that had been left uncovered for too long. She stood outside the house of Lisa and Dan, their old friends, clutching her purse as if it would keep her from doing something she didn't yet fully understand. The black dress she'd chosen to wear today wasn't just clothing, it was a challenge, a piece of armor, a way to remind herself that she was still alive, still wanted. Her life had been an hourglass for the past few weeks, each grain a result of unspoken words, Andrew's glances at his phone, that damn photo from the office party Mark had shown her, casually. Today, she didn't want to be Rachel, waiting for her husband to remember she existed. Today, she wanted to rebel. Lisa and Dan's house was buzzing like a beehive. Music something hip and bassy wafted from the speakers, mixing with the hubbub of voices and the clink of glasses. The backyard, decked out in garlands that Dan had strung up with the pride of a child showing off his craft, glowed like a movie set. There were about 40 guests, some dancing in the living room, some chatting at the makeshift bar, some smoking on the porch, blowing clouds of smoke into the warm air. Rachel walked in, and several heads turned. She knew she looked good. Her black dress showed off her trim figure, and her flowing brown hair added a wild edge. But inside, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Rachel, Lisa, the hostess, in a bright yellow dress that made her look like a ray of sunshine, flew up to her with 2 glasses of champagne. "You look stunning as always. Where's Andrew?" "He's running late," Rachel said, accepting the glass. Her voice was even, but there was a twinge in her chest. "Work, as usual." Lisa rolled her eyes, but her smile remained warm. "Well, have fun for both of you then." She clinked glasses with Rachel and fluttered off to join the other guests, leaving her alone in the midst of the party noise. Rachel took a sip. The champagne was cold, the bubbles tingling her tongue, and she had drunk more than she had intended. She wandered around the living room, exchanging small conversations with people she knew, but her eyes were constantly searching for someone. It took her a moment to realize she was looking for Mark. He was at the bar, the center of attention as always, mixing drinks with the air of a man who knew everyone was watching. His dark shirt was unbuttoned to the top button, and his smile, that same one with a hint of mockery, was both inviting and dangerous. "Ratch, you're like a Black Panther today," he said, spotting her. He handed her a glass of red wine without asking if she wanted any. "This is for you. You look like you're ready to tear someone apart." Rachel took the glass, feeling the warmth of the alcohol already coursing through her veins. She didn't want to admit that his words had touched something inside her, something she was trying to suppress. "Maybe I am," she said, taking a long sip. The wine was tart, with a hint of cherry, and it went straight to her head. "What, are you planning on being a bartender all night?" Mark laughed, leaning a little closer. "Only for those who deserve it." His gaze lingered on her, and Rachel felt something inside her tense. Not fear, not embarrassment, but something else, something more dangerous. She moved away from the bar to keep the conversation from going too far, but Mark followed her. They talked about small things, about music, about how Dan had nearly burned down the kitchen making appetizers, about Sarah arguing with someone about politics again. But every time Mark poured her wine, his fingers would brush against her arm, and Rachel wouldn't pull away. She drank more than she should have, feeling her control slipping, her anger at Andrew, at his constant absences, at the woman in the photo, turning into something alive and pulsating. By midnight, the party had picked up speed. The living room had become a dance floor, bodies moving to a rhythm that felt almost primal to Rachel. She was dancing not with Mark, but with one of Lisa's friends, but her eyes kept returning to him. He was standing against the wall, watching her, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't ignore. The wine made everything easier. It drowned out reason, dulled the guilt. As the music changed to something slow, Mark came over and took her hand. "Come on," he said, his voice lower than usual. "It's too noisy here." Rachel didn't ask where they were going. She let him lead her into the backyard, where the fairy lights cast golden shadows on the grass. They stopped by an old oak tree, away from the light and noise. The air was warm, smelling of grass and someone's cigarette smoke. Mark stood close, too close, but Rachel didn't back away. "You don't look like yourself today," he said, looking into her eyes. "Is something wrong?" She wanted to brush it off, to say something witty, but wine and fatigue loosened her tongue. "It's not like that," she blurted out. "Andrew, he's not even here. He's never here. And I'm tired of being the one waiting." Mark stepped closer, and his hand touched her shoulder. It was a light touch, but it burned her like a spark. "You don't have to wait, Ratch," he said quietly. "You deserve more. Someone who sees you. Someone who wants you." She knew it was a trap. She knew Mark was not a man she could trust. But in that moment, under the twinkling lights, with wine in her blood and anger in her heart, she didn't want to think. She wanted to feel. Mark leaned down and kissed her, slowly, carefully, as if giving her a chance to pull away. But Rachel didn't pull away. She responded, and the kiss deepened, hungrier, as if they both knew they were crossing a line. "Come on," he whispered, pulling away, his eyes shining in the dim light. Rachel nodded without saying a word. She wasn't thinking about the consequences. She wasn't thinking about Sarah. She wasn't thinking about Andrew. There was only anger in her head and the desire to hit, to destroy, to take revenge. They left the party without saying goodbye. Mark led her to his car, parked at the end of the street. It was dark inside and smelled of leather and his cologne. Rachel stared out the window as they drove, her thoughts tangling like wires. She knew she was making a mistake, but she couldn't stop. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a motel on the outskirts of town, a shabby building with a blinking neon sign that cast a reddish glow on the pavement. The room was stuffy, despite the humming air conditioner. The bed was made up with cheap sheets, and a lamp with a tattered shade sat on the nightstand. Rachel stood by the window, looking out at the empty parking lot as Mark closed the door. She didn't turn around when he came up behind her, didn't say anything when his hands settled on her waist. She felt her dress slipping off her shoulders, his breath on her neck. This wasn't love, this wasn't passion, this was revenge, raw, desperate, like a scream she'd held back for too long. The night passed in a feverish haze. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if they were both trying to numb something, her pain, he his greed. When it was over, Rachel lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, where the shadows of a neon sign danced like ghosts. Mark slept beside her, his breathing even, but to her it sounded like an accusation. She felt no relief, no victory, only emptiness and shame that washed over her in waves, like nausea. She stood up, quietly, so as not to wake him, and got dressed. The dress that had seemed like a symbol of strength yesterday now felt alien. She walked out of the room without looking back and into the taxi she had called on the phone. On the way home, she watched the city lights pass by and felt something inside her crumble. She wanted to get revenge on Andrew, to show him that she was not invisible, not an appendage to his life. But instead, she had betrayed herself, and that was the worst thing of all. It was 3 in the morning when she walked into the house. Andrew was asleep in their bedroom, his phone on the nightstand, blinking with notifications. Rachel went into the bathroom, turned on the water, and stood under the shower for a long time, as if she could wash the night away. But the water didn't help. She felt violated, crushed, broken not by Mark, not by Andrew, but by her own weakness. She wanted to scream, but instead she cried, quietly, so as not to wake her husband. She woke up the next morning with a heavy head and an emptiness in her chest. Andrew had already left for work, leaving a note. "Sorry, I missed the party. Love you." She crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. Her revenge had brought nothing but pain, and now she had to live with it. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The silence in the Carter house was almost tangible, as if the air had thickened, absorbing unspoken words and looks that no longer met. A week had passed since that fateful party, and Rachel lived as if she were balancing on a thin wire over an abyss. Every morning she woke up feeling that her night with Mark was about to burst out like water from a cracked dam. She tried to be her old self, making breakfast, smiling at Andrew, joking with clients at the gym. But every time she caught her reflection in the mirror, her eyes betrayed the truth, a shadow of guilt that would not go away. Andrew had changed too. His usual aloofness, which Rachel had once chalked up to work, now seemed more than that. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and his smile, the one that had once made her heart beat faster, appeared less often. He looked at her as if he were trying to solve a riddle, but was too afraid to ask. Rachel could feel it, and every time he looked at her, it was like a sting. She told herself that he knew nothing, that she was being careful, that Mark, despite his slippery nature, wouldn't blab. But deep down, she knew that the truth always found a way out. Tuesday morning began with the usual routine, but something was off. Andrew was drinking coffee, staring at his phone as usual, but his fingers were moving more slowly across the screen, as if he wasn't reading, just staring at one point. Rachel was standing at the stove, frying an omelet, trying to fill the silence. "What do you have today?" she asked, trying to sound light. "Meetings until late again." Andrew looked up, and for a moment she thought she saw something sharp, almost accusing, in his eyes. "Yes," he answered shortly, "as always." He finished his coffee, put the mug in the sink, and left without another word. The door slammed, and Rachel was alone, her heart clenching. She tried to tell herself that this was paranoia, that he was just tired, that his coldness was just work. But inside, there was a growing feeling that something was about to break. All day at the Energy Fitness Center, she was distracted. Clients noticed that her commands sounded mechanical, that her smiles didn't reach her eyes. During her break, she sat in the trainer's office, staring at her phone, fighting the urge to text Mark. She hadn't spoken to him since that night, but his presence haunted her like a shadow. She knew he wasn't the type to keep his mouth shut, but she hoped that his friendship with Andrew, or at least Sarah, would stop him from doing something stupid. It was a slim hope, and she knew it. Andrew, meanwhile, sat in his office on the 23rd floor of the Nexus. The glass walls of his office reflected the city, but he didn't notice the glittering rooftops or the river in the distance. His mind was elsewhere. For the past few days, he'd felt like Rachel was slipping through his fingers. She was there, making dinner, smiling, asking about his day, but there was something alien in her voice, in the way she moved. He tried to chalk it up to his overtime, to her exhaustion from work, but something inside him told him there was more to it than that. His phone vibrated, and a text from Mark popped up on the screen. "Need to meet. Gotta talk. Pub on the corner, 6 p.m. Andrew frowned. Mark rarely texted so seriously. His messages were usually full of jokes or meme references, but something about his tone made Andrew agree. He responded with a short "okay" and went back to work, but he couldn't concentrate. The Rusty Anchor was a noisy pub, with wooden tables that smelled of beer and dim lighting that made everything seem a little closer than it was. Andrew arrived first, ordered an ale, and sat in the corner, away from the bar. Mark emerged 10 minutes later, wearing his usual dark shirt, but without his usual smirk. His face was serious, almost grim, and Andrew immediately felt his insides tighten. "What's the urgency?" Andrew asked as Mark sat down across from him, ordering a whiskey. Mark took a sip, looking away as if choosing his words. Then he pulled out his phone, fiddled with it for a few seconds, and handed it to Andrew. "Look," he said quietly, "you have to see this." Andrew picked up the phone and his eyes fell on the screen. The photo was a punch to the gut. Rachel, sleeping, completely naked, on rumpled sheets. Beside her, in the dim light, was part of Mark's shoulder. Andrew felt the blood drain from his face. His fingers gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. This what? His voice was hoarse, almost alien. Mark looked away, but there was no remorse in his tone. It was at Lisa and Dan's party. She got drunk, we got talking, and it went too far. I thought you should know. Andrew stared at the photo, unable to look away. Rachel, his Rachel, lay there, vulnerable, alien, next to the man he considered a friend. He felt something inside him break, not just his heart, but something deeper, the foundation on which his life rested. You, he began, but the word stuck. He threw the phone on the table and stood up, knocking over his chair. You slept with my wife and decided you could just show me. Mark raised his hands as if defending himself. Andrew, listen, I didn't mean for this to happen. She was upset. She was talking about you, about some colleague. She thought you. What? Andrew barked, and several heads in the pub turned in their direction. That I'm cheating on her? It's because of your fucking office party photo, right? You showed it to me yourself, Mark. Mark shrugged, and a shadow of that slippery smile that Andrew had always hated flickered in his eyes. I just showed the truth. And what happened next? That's her choice. Andrew clenched his fists, feeling the rage boiling inside him. He wanted to punch Mark, to smash his face in, but something stopped him, not fear, but the emptiness that was growing stronger. He turned and walked out of the pub without another word. The air outside was cool, but he felt nothing except the pain pulsing in his chest. Rachel returned home late after another workout. She was tired, but not physically tired. She was worn out by the tension she had been carrying around since that night. She tried not to look Andrew in the eye, afraid he would see the truth. But when she walked into the house, he was gone. On the kitchen table was a note, written in his neat handwriting. I know, I need time. Rachel felt the floor shift beneath her. She grabbed the note, reading it over and over, as if the words might change. But they didn't. He knew about Mark, about that night, about her betrayal. She collapsed into a chair, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to run after him, to explain, but how could she explain something she didn't understand? When Andrew returned a few hours later, she was still sitting in the kitchen, clutching the note. He looked like he had aged 10 years. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were red, his face was gray. He stood in the doorway, looking at her, and there was nothing in his eyes but pain. Andrew, she began, standing up, but he raised his hand, stopping her. Don't, he said quietly, but his voice shook with barely contained rage. Mark showed me the photo. You slept with him. With Mark, how could you? Rachel felt her throat tighten. She wanted to scream that it was a mistake, that she was drunk, that it was all his fault, his aloofness, the rumors Mark had planted himself. But the words sounded pathetic even in her head. I thought you. She stopped, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mark said you were with someone at work. Show me a photo of you with that woman. I was desperate, Andrew. I didn't know what to do. And you decided to sleep with my friend? His voice rose to a scream, and Rachel flinched. You could have talked to me, Rachel. You could have asked. But instead you. He paused, running his hand over his face. His eyes were shining, and Rachel realized he was crying not loudly, not theatrically, but quietly, like a man who had no more strength. I didn't cheat on you, he said finally. Never. That woman in the photo is just a colleague. We were discussing a project. That's all there was. And you ruined everything. Rachel wanted to protest, wanted to say that it wasn't her who had destroyed it, that their marriage had been falling apart for a long time. But she kept quiet because she knew he was right. Her choice, her revenge, her weakness, it was all on her. Andrew turned towards the door. I can't stay here, he said without looking at her. I need time. Andrew, please, she begged, stepping towards him, but he was already gone and the door slammed, leaving her in a silence that was louder than any scream. Rachel sank to the floor, clutching the note that now felt like a death sentence. She wanted revenge, she wanted to feel stronger, but instead she had lost everything. Andrew was broken, angry, and she didn't know if he would come back. And deep down, she was afraid that even if he did, nothing would ever be the same. A month had passed since the night Andrew had left, leaving a note on the kitchen table that had split their lives into before and after. The house in Maplewood, once warm and full of memories, now seemed foreign to Rachel, as if she were a guest in a museum of her own life. Every detail, the photos on the mantel, the coffee machine they had chosen together, even the creaking of the floorboards was a reminder of what she had lost. Andrew had not returned, had not called, had not written. Only one day, a week after the scandal, an envelope with divorce papers appeared in the mail. His signature, neat and cold, stood at the bottom of each page, like a death sentence. Rachel held the papers in her hands, feeling her fingers tremble, but she could not bring herself to sign them. She still hoped for what, she did not know. Andrew rented a small apartment downtown, a few miles from Maplewood. It was a bland apartment complex with gray walls and windows that looked out onto a parking lot. His new life was just as sterile: a bed, a desk, a couple of boxes of things he'd taken from home. He didn't unpack them, as if he couldn't believe that this was his home anymore. His work at Nexus was more consuming than ever, but even the endless meetings and deadlines couldn't ease the pain that had settled in his chest. He didn't understand how it had all fallen apart so quickly. Rachel, his Rachel, the one who'd laughed at his jokes and held his hand in their early years, was capable of betrayal. And Mark, the man he'd considered a friend, was part of this nightmare. Andrew avoided thinking about that night in the pub, about the photo Mark had shown him. But the image of Rachel, sleeping, naked, next to that bastard, came back again and again, like a haunting nightmare. He tried to understand why she had done it. Was it revenge for his withdrawal, for his late arrival home, or had she simply stopped loving him? The questions swirled around in his head, but there were no answers. He felt broken, but the anger that had flared that night had now been replaced by a coldness, not the kind that comforted, but the kind that froze everything inside. Rachel, alone in the house, tried to move on with her life. She went to work, taught classes, smiled at her clients, but it was all mechanical, like the movements of a puppet. Her friends, Lisa and Sarah, tried to support her, but their words, "Everything will be fine. Give him time," rang hollow. Rachel couldn't tell them the truth. She couldn't admit that she'd slept with Mark, that her anger and despair had pushed her to take the step that destroyed everything. She'd seen Sarah, Mark's wife, at one of her classes, and her smile, so sincere, was like a knife in the heart. Sarah didn't know anything, and Rachel prayed that it would stay that way. But Andrew's silence was the worst. He didn't answer her texts, didn't pick up the phone. She'd written him once, a long letter full of apologies and explanations, but she'd sent it off into thin air. He hadn't even read it. The divorce papers lay on the kitchen table, and every time she passed them, she could feel them staring at her, accusing. She wanted to sign them, to get it over with, but every time she picked up her pen, her hand froze. She still loved him, or what was left of their love. Andrew, immersed in his work, tried to stay away from places where he might run into Mark. He knew that if he saw him, he would not be able to resist. But fate, as often happens, had other plans. On Friday evening, after another endless day at the office, Andrew stopped at the coffee shop on the corner to get a coffee before heading to his empty apartment. He stood at the counter, waiting for his order, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Yet it went swimmingly, Mark was saying, sitting at a table in the corner with a man Andrew didn't know. His tone was as slick as ever, with the same mocking undertone. She was hooked, drunk, and angry. I just pushed her a little further. Andrew froze, feeling his blood run cold. He turned, slowly, as if afraid it was a mirage. But Mark was there, in his dark shirt, holding a beer, and the other man, a man in his 40s with a balding head, chuckled as if he had heard a good joke. "Are you serious?" the man said, shaking his head. "And Andrew still doesn't know you planned this?" Mark chuckled, and his smile was so cynical that Andrew felt his fists clench involuntarily. He was blind, man, blind. I showed him that photo from the office party, dropped a few hints, and she broke. All I could do was pour her some wine and wait. He took a sip of beer and added honestly, I didn't even expect it to be that easy. Andrew felt the world around him narrow down to a single point. He took a step toward their table, not realizing what he was doing. Mark looked up and froze, his smile slowly fading. Andrew, he began, but did not have time to finish. You set this up, Andrew said, his voice quiet but trembling with fury. You drove her to this on purpose. You destroyed my family. Mark leaned back in his chair, trying to remain calm, but his eyes betrayed a slight panic. Hey, slow down, he said, raising his hands. She made her own choice. I just... Just what? Andrew barked, and the coffee shop went silent, all eyes turning to them. Spilled her wine, showed her a photo that made her think I was cheating. You're a cynical bastard, Mark. The man across from Mark coughed, clearly feeling out of place, and muttered something about the toilet, quickly retreating. Mark was left alone, and his mask of confidence began to crack. Listen, Andrew, he said, lowering his voice. You were blind yourself. You didn't see her suffering. You lived for your work, and she was alone. I just gave her what she wanted. Andrew stepped closer, and for a moment it seemed as if he was going to strike. But he stopped, his breathing heavy, as if he were holding back a storm. You gave her nothing, he said, almost in a whisper. You used her. And me. You're not a friend, Mark. You're nobody. He turned and walked out, leaving Mark sitting alone. It was chilly outside, but Andrew didn't feel the cold. He felt only emptiness and a new, sharp pain from the realization that everything he had believed in had been built on a lie. Not just Rachel's, but Mark's manipulations, too. Back in his apartment, Andrew collapsed on the couch without turning on the light. The divorce papers were on the table, already signed but not yet mailed. He looked at them, and Mark's words kept playing in his head. You were blind. He hated him for it, but deep down he knew Mark was right. He hadn't seen Rachel drift away, her loneliness growing, their marriage falling apart. He was too busy with his career, his projects, his deadlines. But that didn't excuse her, and it certainly didn't excuse Mark. He pulled out his phone and opened his conversation with Rachel. Her last text, full of apologies, had gone unanswered. He wanted to text her, to tell her about Mark, about his confession, but his fingers froze over the screen. What would it change? She had made her choice anyway. She had slept with Mark, knowing it would destroy them. And yet the thought that Mark had manipulated her, poisoning her doubts, was nagging at him. Andrew put his phone down and closed his eyes. He was angry at Mark, at Rachel, at himself. But most of all, he was broken. The life he had built with such confidence was a house of cards, and now he didn't know how to put it back together. Rachel, meanwhile, sat in their house, staring at the same divorce papers. She still hadn't signed them, even though she knew she should. She tried to move on with her life, but every day had felt like running in circles. She'd avoided Mark, she'd avoided Sarah, afraid the truth would come out. But now that Andrew knew, she had nowhere to run. She wanted to call him, she wanted to explain, but what could she say? That she was drunk, that Mark had pushed her. It sounded pathetic, and she knew it. That evening, as the shadows in the house grew longer, she picked up her phone and texted him. Please, let's talk. I don't want it to end like this. She sent the message and sat staring at the screen, but there was no answer. Only silence, cold, pitiless, like the documents lying in front of her. Andrew didn't come home that night. He stayed in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. The divorce had seemed inevitable, but now that he knew Mark had set it up, he felt even more lost. He wanted to hate Rachel, but he couldn't. He wanted to forget her, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, not the one in Mark's photo, but the way it used to be when they were happy. And that was the worst thing. The silence in the Maplewood house was more than just a backdrop. It was a presence that filled every corner, every breath. Rachel sat on the living room couch, clutching her phone, its screen still dark. It had been almost a month since Andrew had left, leaving a note, and a week since she had sent him her last text, begging to talk. There had been no response. The divorce papers he had sent her still sat on the kitchen table, unsigned, a silent reproach. She knew she should sign, let him go, but every time she picked up the pen, her hand froze. She couldn't, not because she believed in miracles, but because the truth she had learned yesterday had turned everything inside out. It all started with an unexpected call from Lisa, the friend who had thrown the fateful party. Lisa had called that morning, her voice excited, almost terrified. She had overheard Mark talking in a coffee shop, the same Mark whose name now made Rachel sick. Lisa had heard him bragging to his friend about how cleverly he had conned Rachel, slipping her a photo of Andrew's office party and pouring her wine at just the right moment. He had laughed, calling Andrew a blind idiot who hadn't noticed his marriage was falling apart. But most importantly, Lisa had heard Mark say that Andrew had never cheated. The woman in the photo, a coworker, had just been a coworker. No romance, no fling. It had all been a lie Mark had created to push Rachel over the edge. Rachel listened to Lisa, feeling the floor shift beneath her. She sat in the kitchen, clutching the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white, unable to speak. When Lisa finished, apologizing for not telling him sooner, Rachel just muttered, "Thanks for telling me." She hung up and stared into space. Andrew hadn't cheated. Everything she'd thought she'd justified in her vengeance, the rumors, the photos, her own assumptions had been a lie. And what she'd done, the night with Mark, had been real. And now that reality stood between her and Andrew like a wall she'd built. Rachel knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit there and let her life fall apart. She wanted to prove to Andrew that she still loved him, that she was willing to fight even if he never forgave her. The first thing she did was cut ties with Mark. She blocked his number, deleted him from all social media, even from the old group chats where they used to joke with friends. She wrote a short message to Sarah, Mark's wife. "I need some time to sort myself out. I'm sorry if I've been distant." She couldn't tell Sarah the truth, that would have been too cruel, but the thought of Sarah not knowing was tearing her apart. Then she took charge of herself. She stopped hiding behind her work, behind smiling for her clients, behind the appearance of a normal life. She wanted to be honest, at least with herself. She got up early every morning, ran through the park before the sun rose, and tried to sort out her feelings. She wrote letters to Andrew, not sending them, just pouring out onto paper everything she couldn't say out loud. "I was blind," she wrote. "I believed the lies because I was weak. But I love you, Andrew, and I always have." The paper absorbed her words, but not the pain. She decided to find Andrew. She knew he had rented an apartment in the center, but she didn't have the exact address. She called him, wrote to him, but he didn't answer. In desperation, she went to the Nexus office, hoping to find him there. The security guard at the entrance recognized her. She had been there before, for corporate events and company family days. He said Andrew had left an hour ago, but advised her to check the coffee shop on the corner, where employees often had coffee after work. Rachel walked into the coffee shop, her heart pounding. She saw him right away, sitting in the corner, drinking black coffee, looking out the window. His face was tired, the shadows under his eyes seemed deeper than before. She took a step toward him, but stopped. What could she say? "I'm sorry, was I wrong? I found out you weren't cheating." It sounded pathetic, and she knew that what she had done staying the night with Mark overrode any excuse. She came up anyway, her steps were uncertain, like those of a child who is afraid of falling. "Andrew," she said quietly, stopping at his table. He looked up, and for a moment she thought she saw a hint of melancholy in his eyes. But it quickly turned cold. "What are you doing here?" His voice was even, but there was a sense of the wall he had erected between them. "I wanted to talk," she said, sitting down across from him, although he hadn't invited her. I found out. I found out that you weren't cheating. It was all Mark. He set it all up, showed me that photo, so I'd think." Andrew interrupted her, his voice sharper. "I know," he said, and there was such weariness in his tone that Rachel felt her heart clench. "I know Mark set it up. He admitted it. But that doesn't change what you did, Rachel." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck. He was right. She had made a choice, a drunken, desperate one, but her own. And now she faced the consequences. "I cut him off," she said quietly, looking down at the table. I blocked him, cut him out of my life. I don't want him anywhere near me. I want. I want us back, Andrew. I know I'm guilty, but I love you. Andrew looked at her, and there was so much pain in his eyes that she could hardly breathe. You think that's enough? He asked, almost a whisper. You think you can just say, I'm sorry, and it will all go away? I see you with him, Rachel. Every time I close my eyes, I see you with Mark, and it won't go away. She felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want him to see her weakness, not now. I'll do anything to prove that I've changed, she said. Give me a chance, Andrew. Please. He shook his head, finished his coffee, and stood up. I don't know if I can, he said. I need time. Don't call me anymore. He walked away, leaving her sitting at the table, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. She wanted to scream, to run after him, but she stayed where she was. The truth that Andrew hadn't cheated on her should have brought her relief, but instead it only deepened her guilt. She had betrayed him by believing a lie, and now no words could fix it. The days dragged on, each one a carbon copy of the last. Rachel threw everything she had into proving her love, even though she knew it might be in vain. She went to therapy, trying to figure out why she had been so easily manipulated by Mark. She wrote Andrew letters, not sending them, but putting them in a drawer like talismans. She returned to their old habits, cooking his favorite shrimp pasta even though she ate it alone, listening to Coldplay, their shared album that now sounded like a requiem. She even started running along their old route in the park, where they used to walk together, hoping that it would somehow bring her closer to him. But Andrew remained distant. He didn't come home, didn't answer her texts. The divorce papers were still on the table, and every time she passed them, she felt them like a knife in her back. She knew he was right, her betrayal was real, and no truth about Mark could undo it. But she couldn't stop. She wanted to fight, even if it was hopeless. One night, after another workout, she sat in her car parked outside her house and looked at an old photo of them that she kept on her phone. They were on a beach in Mexico, laughing, hugging each other. Back then, anything had seemed possible. Now, she felt like she had lost not only Andrew, but herself. She wrote him another message. I know I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes. She sent it, knowing he probably wouldn't answer. But it was all she could do: wait, hope, try. Autumn had come to Maplewood quietly but decisively, painting the trees crimson and covering the sidewalks with crisp leaves. Number 17, once a symbol of comfort and happiness, now looked like the set of a movie that no one wanted to finish. The windows were dark, the lawn was slightly overgrown, and the peonies on the porch had withered to bare stems. Rachel Carter sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the boxes she had spent the last few days packing. The divorce papers, finally signed, lay in an envelope on the table, next to a one-way plane ticket. She was leaving not just a city, but a country, a life that had been hers. But even now, on the brink of a new beginning, she felt the past clinging to her like barbed wire. It had been 2 months since she had learned the truth about Andrew not being unfaithful, and since she had tried in vain to get him back. Her efforts, her letters, her tears had changed nothing. Andrew was adamant. He could not forgive her betrayal, even knowing that Mark had manipulated her. Their last meeting in a coffee shop, where she had begged him to give her a chance, had been the point of no return. His gaze, cold but full of pain, had told her more than words could. He did not want to hate her, but he could no longer love her either. The divorce was finalized quickly, almost mechanically. Andrew's lawyer sent the papers, and Rachel, after many nights of deliberation, signed. She didn't argue, didn't demand a division of property, didn't try to stall. The house was hers, Andrew insisted, saying he didn't want to go back to a place where everything reminded him of the past. But Rachel couldn't stay. Every corner of that house was soaked with memories, their laughter, their fights, their love that had once seemed eternal. She sold the house without looking back and began looking for ways to move as far away as possible. Rachel sat at the airport, staring at the board where the names of cities flashed: London, Paris, Tokyo. Her ticket was to Lisbon. She had found a job with an international chain of fitness centers that was opening a new location in Portugal. Being a training program coordinator was not what she had dreamed of as a teenager, but it was a chance to start over in a place where no one knew her story, where there was no Mark or Andrew or the ghosts of their marriage. She looked at her suitcase at her feet and tried to convince herself that this was not an escape, but a step forward. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was running away from herself, from her guilt, from the pain she had caused. Her thoughts were interrupted by a ringing voice. Lisa's name appeared on the screen, and Rachel hesitated before answering. "Are you at the airport yet?" Lisa's voice was warm, but with a hint of worry. "Ratch, are you sure you want to leave? It's so far away." Rachel forced herself to smile, though Lisa couldn't see it. "I'm sure," she said, though her voice shook. "I need this, Lisa. Here, everything here reminds me of him. Of us. I can't take it anymore." Lisa sighed, and Rachel heard her struggling for words. "I just want you to be happy," she finally said. "You deserve it, no matter what." Rachel swallowed hard. She didn't feel like she deserved to be happy, not after what she'd done. But she thanked Lisa and hung up, afraid she'd burst into tears right there in the waiting room. Andrew, meanwhile, lived his new, drab life. His downtown apartment remained half empty. Boxes of clothes lay unpacked, and only his laptop and a few mugs from the coffee shop lay on the table. His work at Nexus consumed him, but now it was less an escape than a way to drown out his thoughts. He avoided friends, avoided places where he might run into Mark or anyone who would remind him of the past. But the past still found him in a random song on the radio, in the smell of coffee that reminded him of mornings with Rachel, in her texts that he read but did not respond to. He knew she was leaving. Lisa, the only one who still tried to keep in touch with both of them, told him about Lisbon. Andrew nodded, listening, but said nothing. He didn't want to know where she was going, and at the same time, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He hated her for betraying him, but he hated himself even more for still loving her. He knew Mark had set it up. He knew what she had done was a mistake, born of desperation and lies. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her with Mark, and it was like a knife he couldn't pull out. One evening, on his way home from work, he walked into the same pub where Mark had shown him the photo a month earlier. He didn't know why he'd come. Maybe he was looking for answers. Maybe he was trying to numb the pain. The pub was loud, full of people laughing and clinking glasses as if their world hadn't ended. Andrew ordered a whiskey and sat at the bar, looking at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He looked tired, older, like a man who'd lost more than he could afford. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Mark. He was sitting in the corner with a group, talking loudly, his laughter cutting like glass. Andrew clutched his glass, feeling the rage he had been suppressing for weeks rise up again. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to stoop to his level, but his feet carried him to that table. "Andrew." Mark noticed him and grinned, but there was a wariness in his eyes. "What a meeting. Decided to get drunk?" Andrew didn't answer. He looked at Mark, and there was so much coldness in his gaze that even Mark seemed to sense it. "Are you happy?" Andrew asked quietly. "Did you get what you wanted? Did you destroy everything?" Mark leaned back in his chair, his grin widening. "I didn't ruin anything," he said. "You blew it all. She was unhappy, and you were too busy with your own projects to notice. I just accelerated the process." Andrew felt his fists clench, but he held back. "You're a liar," he said, almost in a whisper. "And you know it. But the funny thing is, you think you've won, and you're just pathetic." Mark opened his mouth to answer, but Andrew had already turned and left. He didn't want to hear his excuses, his cynicism. He wanted only one thing to forget. But oblivion did not come. Rachel stood at the check-in counter at Lisbon Airport, feeling the warm Portuguese air wash over her. The city was loud, vibrant, full of life, but she felt like an outsider. Her new boss, a tall man with an accent, greeted her with a smile and drove her to the small apartment the company had rented for her. It wasn't luxurious, but it was cozy. White walls, wooden floors, a window overlooking a narrow street where locals drank coffee and chatted. Rachel unpacked her suitcase, but left the box of personal belongings, photos, old letters, souvenirs from her, and Andrew's trips untouched. She wasn't ready to open it. Maybe she never would. The job at the gym started a week later, and Rachel threw herself into it. She led workouts, designed programs, smiled at her new colleagues, and learned Portuguese phrases. But every night, when she returned to her apartment, she felt the loneliness wash over her like a wave. She tried not to think about Andrew, but he was everywhere, in the smell of coffee, in the sound of the sea, in the silence that fell when she turned off the lights. One day, sitting on the balcony with a glass of wine, she opened her laptop and started writing a letter. Not to Andrew, she knew he wouldn't write back. To herself. She wrote about how she'd messed up, how she'd given in to her anger, how she'd let Mark ruin her life. She wrote about the love that still lived inside her, despite everything, and how maybe one day she'd forgive herself. But not yet. Andrew stayed in town, but his life was like a black and white photograph. He worked, met with colleagues, sometimes drank with friends, but it was all empty. He knew that Rachel had left, knew that she had started a new life, and somewhere deep inside, he wanted her to be happy, even if he couldn't say it out loud. But he couldn't forget. Not her betrayal, not Mark, not himself blind, as Mark said. The divorce ended their story, but not their pain. They both carried it with them, he in his gray apartment, she in sunny Lisbon. And maybe one day they will find peace. But not yet. 2 years passed like the wind over autumn fields, leaving only a rustle of memories in their wake. Maplewood had changed. New houses had sprung up in the vacant lots, the coffee shop on the corner had changed its sign, and the old oak tree in Lisa and Dan's backyard was now adorned with a children's swing. But for Andrew Carter, time seemed to have stood still. He still lived in the same gray apartment downtown, with boxes of his things left unpacked, as if he were waiting to return to his old life. His work at Nexus consumed his days. Meetings, presentations, endless spreadsheets and graphs. He was good at it, even better than before, but every night when he came home, he felt an emptiness that was growing, like a crack in the wall. It didn't hurt like it used to, but it was always there, a reminder of what he had lost. Andrew tried not to think about Rachel. He knew she was in Lisbon. He knew she was working at a gym somewhere, building a new life. Lisa, their mutual friend, would sometimes mention her in conversation, but Andrew would quickly change the subject. He didn't want to know if she was happy, if she'd found someone, if she'd gotten over him. But deep down, he could still see her, not the Rachel who'd betrayed him, but the one who'd laughed on their first trip to Mexico, who'd held his hand on cold nights, who'd sung along to the radio while she cooked dinner. These memories were like old photographs he couldn't throw away, but also couldn't bring himself to open. His life had become routine. Work, the occasional meeting with friends, evenings with a glass of whiskey by the window. He wasn't looking for a new relationship, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Something had broken inside him the night Mark showed him that photo. He had forgiven Rachel not with words, not with her, but somewhere in his heart, but he couldn't forget. And he hadn't seen Mark since that night in the pub, when Mark had cynically confessed his plan. Andrew had heard that Mark and Sarah had divorced, that he had moved out west somewhere, but he didn't care. Mark had ceased to exist for him, as had the part of his life where they had been friends. In Lisbon, Rachel Carter, now just Rachel, with no last name to evoke her past, was building a new version of herself. Her apartment in the old Alfama neighborhood was small but bright, with windows overlooking cobbled streets that smelled of coffee and fresh bread in the morning. She worked as a coordinator for an international chain of fitness centers, and her days were filled with workouts, meetings, and planning. She learned to speak Portuguese not perfectly, but enough to joke with coworkers and order wine at a cafe. She even made friends: Maria, a yoga instructor, and Pedro, a bartender at a neighborhood bar who always saved her the best table. But every night, when she returned home, she felt the loneliness wash over her like a tide. Rachel tried not to think about Andrew, but he was everywhere. In the smell of the sea that reminded her of their trips, in the Coldplay songs she avoided, in the silence of her apartment without his voice. She had cut ties with Mark, as she had promised, and had even written Sarah an apology, not revealing the whole truth, but admitting that she had failed her as a friend. Sarah hadn't written back, and Rachel didn't blame her. She blamed herself for everything. For believing Mark's lies, for giving in to her anger, for ruining their marriage. She had seen a therapist, she had written in her journal, she had gone jogging along the Tagus River in the mornings, but the guilt had not gone away. She had learned to live with it, but not to accept it. Lisbon gave her a chance to start over, but her new life wasn't what she'd imagined. She was successful, confident, but not happy. She smiled at work, laughed with friends, but there was always a shadow in her eyes. She knew she didn't deserve happiness, not after what she'd done. But she kept going, because to stop would be to drown. Everything changed one Saturday when Rachel returned to Maplewood. She hadn't planned on coming back, at least not anytime soon. But Lisa, who was still her friend despite everything, insisted she come to her son Jake's birthday party. "It's a small gathering, just the family," Lisa said over the phone. "Jake will be 5, and he's been asking about you. Please come." Rachel couldn't refuse. Lisa was one of the few people who hadn't turned on her since the divorce, and she felt she had to be there. She flew in on Friday night and checked into a small hotel just outside Maplewood. The town greeted her with familiar smells: newly mown grass, coffee from the corner coffee shop, the autumn breeze. But everything was foreign. Their old house was now owned by a young family, its windows gleaming with new curtains. Rachel walked past without stopping, but her heart sank. She hadn't been prepared for how much it would hurt. The party was in full swing at Lisa and Dan's house when she arrived. The backyard was decorated with colorful balloons, kids were running around screaming, and adults were drinking lemonade and chatting under the tent. Jake, the birthday boy, was running around in a blue superhero costume with a plastic sword, and Lisa, as always, was the center of it all, handing out cupcakes and laughing. Rachel walked in feeling like an outsider, but Lisa immediately hugged her, giving her no time to hesitate. "You're here," she cried, her eyes shining. "Jake will be thrilled. And so will I." Rachel smiled, trying to hide her nervousness. She picked up a glass of lemonade and began chatting with the guests, but her eyes kept darting around the crowd, as if searching for someone. She didn't know if Andrew would be there. Lisa hadn't mentioned him, but her heart was beating faster at the thought. And there he was. Andrew showed up half an hour later, wearing a navy shirt and jeans, holding a small box tied with a ribbon, a gift for Jake. He looked much the same as before, but there was something different about him. His shoulders were slightly slumped, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Rachel hadn't noticed before. He didn't see her until he walked up to Lisa to say hello, and their eyes met. Time stood still. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs. Andrew froze, his hand hanging in the air, outstretched toward Lisa. They looked at each other across the crowd, across 2 years, across the chasm they had created. "Rachel," he said finally, and his voice was quiet, almost neutral, but there was a tremor in it that she couldn't decipher. "Andrew," she said, clutching her glass so tightly that her fingers were white. "I didn't know you'd be here." He nodded, his gaze sliding over her, not with anger, not with warmth, but with something in between, as if he was trying to figure out who was in front of him. "Lisa insisted," he said with a shrug. "Jake likes my robot stories." Rachel forced a smile, but her heart was pounding. She wanted to say so much, to apologize, to explain, to ask how he was doing, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said, "You look good." He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he would say something warm in response. But he only nodded. "You too." They stood in awkward silence until Lisa called Andrew to help Jake open his present. He left, and Rachel felt her knees shaking. She walked to the edge of the yard, where there were fewer people, and took a deep breath. She hadn't expected this encounter to be so painful or so vivid. The party went on, but Rachel and Andrew kept their distance, like two magnets repelling each other. She saw him playing with Jake, telling stories to the children, laughing with Dan. He was the same Andrew, and yet different. She wanted to go over to him, but she stopped each time. What could she say? That she was happy in Lisbon? That would be a lie. That she was sorry? He knew it without her saying it. As the sun began to set and the guests began to leave, Rachel decided to leave. She said goodbye to Lisa, hugged Jake, and headed for the exit. But at the gate, she heard his voice. "Rachel," Andrew called, and she turned. He was standing a few feet away, holding an empty glass. "Can we talk?" She nodded, feeling her throat tighten. They walked back to the old oak tree where it had all started 2 years ago. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. "I heard you were in Lisbon," he said, looking at the swing, which was swaying slightly in the wind. "How are things there?" "Okay," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Work, friends, a new city, but it's not what I expected." He nodded, as if he understood more than she said. "And you?" she asked, looking at him. "How are you?" Andrew shrugged, his smile bitter. "I live, I work. I try not to think too much." She wanted to ask if he was thinking about her, but instead she said, "I'm still sorry, Andrew, about everything. I know it doesn't change anything, but—" "Don't," he interrupted, but his voice was gentle. "I know you're sorry, and I know about Mark, about his games. But you made a choice, Rachel, and I can't forget that." She nodded, feeling tears sting her eyes. She didn't want to cry, not now, not in front of him. "I just wanted you to know," she said. "I loved you, and I guess I always will." Andrew looked at her, and something flashed in his eyes, not forgiveness, but something close to understanding. "I loved you too," he said quietly, "but sometimes that's not enough." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the oak tree. She watched him go until he disappeared through the gate, and she felt something inside her finally break. But there was freedom in that pain too, as if she had finally let him go. Rachel returned to Lisbon 2 days later. Her apartment greeted her with the familiar smell of coffee and the sea. She unpacked her suitcase, but never opened the box of their old photos. Work had become her salvation again. She led training sessions, smiled at her colleagues, learned new Portuguese words. But now there was something new in it, not peace, but acceptance. She knew she would never forget Andrew, but maybe one day she would learn to live without him. Andrew returned to his apartment, where everything was the same. He poured himself a whiskey and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. Meeting Rachel had stirred something in him, but he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't hate her. He didn't blame her. He just wanted to move on. And maybe one day he could. 2 years and 3 months after their divorce, Maplewood felt both familiar and foreign. The leaves on the trees were turning yellow, and the air smelled damp and like the first hints of autumn. Andrew Carter stood at the window of his downtown apartment, looking out at the lights below like fallen stars. His life had been regular but empty. His job at Nexus had brought him money and status, but it had done nothing to fill the hole Rachel had left. He had thought that time would heal the wounds, that the pain of her betrayal, Mark's manipulation, and their broken marriage would fade. Instead, it had become a quiet melancholy that followed him like a shadow. Andrew avoided memories of Rachel, but they found him in the most unexpected moments, in the smell of coffee that reminded him of their mornings, in a Coldplay song coming from the radio in a taxi, in a chance glance at an old photograph that he had never thrown away. Their meeting at Lisa's son Jake's birthday party 3 months ago had changed everything. He hadn't expected to see her there, in their old town, under the oak tree where it all began. Her eyes, full of pain and hope, had haunted him ever since. He had told her then that he couldn't forget, but now, standing by the window, he wondered if he wanted to forget. Rachel, in her new world in Lisbon, found no peace either. Her apartment in Alfama, overlooking the narrow streets and the Tagus River, was a home but not a refuge. She worked, smiled at her colleagues, drank wine with new friends, but every night, when she returned home, she felt loneliness embrace her like an old friend. She had learned to live with the guilt of her mistake the night with Mark that had destroyed their marriage, but she could not forgive herself. She knew that Andrew had not cheated, that Mark had set it up, but that did not change her choice. She tried to move on, but every step was like running in place. And yet, something had changed since that meeting in Maplewood. Andrew looked at her not with hatred, but with something else: longing, weariness, maybe even forgiveness. She didn't allow herself to hope, but his words, "I loved you too," echoed in her head. She kept them like a talisman, but she didn't dare take a step. She was afraid that he would reject her again, that her love, her regrets, meant nothing against the pain she had caused him. Everything changed one rainy evening in Lisbon. Rachel sat on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, holding a cup of tea. The rain pounded the rooftops, making the city seem softer, as if shrouded in a gray haze. Her phone vibrated, and she glanced at the screen, expecting to see a message from Maria or Pedro. But the name that appeared on the screen made her heart skip a beat: Andrew. She stared at his name, disbelieving her eyes. He hadn't written to her since the divorce, except for that brief exchange where she had begged him to talk. With trembling fingers, she opened the message. "Rachel, I'm in Lisbon. We need to meet. Azulejos, tomorrow at 6 p.m. She read the message 3 times, trying to figure out if this was a dream. Andrew in Lisbon. Why? What did he want? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she responded anyway, "I'll be there." She sent the message and felt her knees shaking. She didn't know what to expect, but one thing was clear: this conversation would change everything. Café Azulejo was small and cozy, with blue tiles on the walls and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Rachel arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a table by the window. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes without screaming effort. She wanted to look like herself, not the Rachel who had tried to prove something 2 years ago, but the Rachel who had learned to live with the truth about herself. Andrew walked in promptly at 6, his dark coat slightly damp from the rain. He looked much the same as he had in Maplewood, but something was different about him. His eyes were softer, his shoulders less tense. He noticed her immediately and approached, not smiling, but not with the coldness she had seen before. "Hello," he said, sitting down opposite her. His voice was quiet but warm, as if he was surprised that he was saying it. "Hello," she replied, clasping her hands under the table to stop them from shaking. "I didn't expect you to be here." Andrew nodded, looking at the cup of coffee the waiter placed in front of him. "I came here for work," he said. "The Nexus conference. But that's not the only reason." Rachel felt her heart speed up. She waited, afraid to breathe. "I've been thinking for a long time," he continued, looking out the window, where the rain was making patterns on the glass. "About us, about what happened. And I realized that part of the blame lies with me. I was cold, Rachel. I lived for my work. I didn't notice how you were drifting away. I gave Mark a chance to manipulate you because I wasn't there when you needed me." She opened her mouth to object, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Wait, I'm not making excuses for you. What you did to Mark, it killed me, but I wasn't perfect either. I didn't trust you, I didn't talk to you, I didn't listen, and I want to fix that." Rachel felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want him to see her weakness, not now. "Andrew," she said quietly, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know what I did. I believed Mark's lies, I gave in to my anger, and that was my choice. I destroyed us. But I never stopped loving you, and I hate myself for hurting you." He looked at her, and in his eyes there was a mixture of pain and something else: hope, maybe. "I love you too," he said, his voice breaking. "And that's the hardest part. I can't forget what happened, but I don't want to live without you. I'm tired of this emptiness." Rachel swallowed hard. She hadn't expected those words, hadn't expected him to be so open. She wanted to rush to him, to hug him, but instead she just nodded. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, "but I'm willing to try, if you are." Andrew nodded, and a shadow of a smile flickered across his face, not the same one as before, but close to it. "I can't promise it'll be like before," he said. "Trust. It can't be restored in a day, but I want to try. I want to see if we can be us." Rachel felt her heart tighten, not in pain, but in relief. She reached her hand across the table, and he hesitated before taking it. His hand was warm and familiar, and for a moment she felt as if they were back in their old house, in the simpler days. "Let's try," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. They left the cafe when the rain had already stopped, leaving behind sparkling puddles and fresh air. Andrew offered to walk her home, and she agreed. They walked in silence, but it was not the silence that had oppressed them before. It was a silence full of possibilities. At one of the intersections, he took her hand, and she did not pull away. His fingers intertwined with hers, and it was like the first step into the unknown. They agreed to meet again when Andrew returned to Maplewood. He asked her to come there for Christmas. Lisa and Dan were throwing a party, and it would be their first time out together. Rachel agreed, her heart pounding with fear and hope. They hadn't spoken of love out loud, but she felt it in his gaze, in his hand, in his willingness to try. A month later, Rachel returned to Maplewood for Christmas. The town was decorated with fairy lights, and the air smelled of pine and hot chocolate. Andrew met her at the airport, and this time he smiled not widely, but genuinely. They drove to Lisa and Dan's, where friends and laughter and warm candlelight awaited them. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt at home. That night, after the party, they walked through the snowy streets of Maplewood, holding hands. The snow fell in soft flakes, settling on their coats, and the town seemed quiet, as if giving them space for a new beginning. They didn't talk about the past, didn't talk about Mark or the pain. They talked about the future carefully, as if they were afraid to scare it away. "I want us to be honest," Andrew said, stopping under a lamppost. "If something's wrong, tell me. I don't want to lose you again." Rachel nodded, feeling the warmth of his words warm her. "Me too," she said. "I want it to work." They kept walking, their steps crunching in the snow, their hands clasped tightly together. They didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were moving in the same direction. The trust was as fragile as first ice, but they were willing to work on it, day after day, step after step. And in that quiet winter night, under the light of the lanterns, they began again. "Keep this story to yourself. Let it settle somewhere deep, and I will return to give you new food for sleepless nights." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.